Hello and welcome to Beyond Top 10 Tennis. My name is Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge and I'm your host. I am the author of 11 books, CEO of 12 years, the founder of a startup set on data privacy, and I think most importantly, an elite performance coach with over 18 years, having worked with athletes throughout Europe, the United States to Australia. And I guess why we're all here, I am the world's leading scientist on coach and athlete performance, specifically when it comes to tennis and developing a top 10 tennis ranking. My work includes mitigating injury through to pathways to develop top 10 players. I'm behind theories from the optimal performance theory, the V by Dr. Berge to the rule of transference. I've coined terms from the barrier breaker to the golden rule. And look, if you've been following along, thank you so much, but I think you are familiar with my background, I guess everything I have accomplished and why we're here, and I guess why Beyond Top 10 Tennis has come to fruition. I'm incredibly fortunate to have my research that uncovered the pathways to specifically develop a top 10 player. And, I put myself in your shoes, whether you're that parent, the player, or the coach. Having, been that player and that coach, if I was able to get my hands on how to become a top 10 player or develop a top 10 player, oh my goodness, it's the jackpot, and I'm just so privileged and honored to be able to share this with you. As has become custom with each episode, we're diving into one of my books and just sharing additional insights. We've been focusing on the secrets to optimal performance success, a comprehensive discussion on developing elite coaches and players. And look, today's episode is something I'm so passionate about, and I know I say that a lot, but it really is, I think, fundamental, and is one of those, I guess, core building blocks that really develops the long game, develops the pathway, and really, I think, contributes wholeheartedly, it does scientifically with the data, to developing that top 10 ranking. So please buckle in, enjoy the ride, and let's get started. Today's episode is on functional movement, center of gravity, and would you believe it, we're up to 3.1, so if you'd like to follow along, we're on page 104. We're getting to that halfway point of the secrets to optimal performance success, and I think by now, if you've been following along, if not, then please, listen to the previous episodes to catch up. Though where we're at now is that we've developed and got our head around some really critical foundations that are fundamental if we're looking at developing that top 10 player. And again, irrespective if you're 12 or 25, everything we talk about, it's never too late. Whether, you are ranked 800 in the world and you're working on getting closer towards that top 100 ranking, to top 80, to top 50, etc. Or you are, that 8, 9, 10-year-old. You are that 14, 15-year-old. You could be that 18-year-old just looking for those initial ranking points. You're diving in, or you're really still developing those the foundations. Irrespective, it's never too late, but two, there's always a role. So again, if you are the beginner or you are the elite, there's always a place for this. Irrespective if we're talking about a coach's pedagogy, your own personal values, if we're looking at your own identity as the athlete as a whole. Everything is cross-transactional to transitional when we're talking about movement parameters to really when we really peel things back and we go, why do you play? Or how is that coach-athlete relationship? How is that triangular dynamic playing out, and so forth? So when we're really looking at it, it doesn't matter what your level is at. We're looking at that end goal. And that end goal here is that top 10 ranking. And we're so fortunate to be talking about the different facets that are, I guess, are intertwined within that. We know why there are some players inside the top 20 who will never, unfortunately, crack the top 10. And I guess I say never quite harshly, but it's more so if they do not change their patterns of play, if they do not change or become privy to that knowledge that underpins that top 10 tennis ranking, they're going to stay at 18, 17 in the world. Same goes top 100 player. They are not going to progress towards that 80, towards that 50, 30, etc. in the world unless they begin adopting and integrating these, individual facets of play. And that's how fundamental it is. So if you are that beginner player, boy, are you lucky, because you're beginning to set your baseline, those foundations with those core ingredients now, opposed to in 10 years' time. So if you are, please, that 18, 19-year-old, you are, that top 300 in the world, this is not to say it's not too late. It's the same. It's the beginning. Because if you begin to implement these practices, these individual facets of play, and you integrate them into your training load, you're developing these optimal performance practices, then you are fortunate enough, you are privy to these keys that will progress you towards, that top 80, top 70, etc., towards top 30, top 20. But it is a continuous cycle. It is a work in progress. And when we're looking at functional movement, oh my goodness, it is fundamental. It is pivotal. And if you recall one of the previous episodes about learning and, how coaches learn, and if they're upskilling and continuously, updating that skill base, a lot of them don't. They don't leverage that science because they're not privy to it. Now, functional movement, of course, we can go very deep into the biomechanics, but we're going to simplify it here. And that's, I think, what functional movement does. Now, if you're not privy to, what that necessarily means, we look at it as how you move your body without compromising, those key areas of influence, which means we're looking at building the foundations, those technical parameters to remove your risk of injury. We all know that injuries can and may still happen due to varying factors. And that is just the nature of, being human. And again, obviously taking that humanized approach. But we're looking at what can we put in place to mitigate this? What can we do to limit that impact of those shoulder injuries that so often happen with athletes? You only have to look at some of the world's most recent Grand Slam champions without name dropping, whether they're on the WTA or ATP tours. You've got injuries galore that still happen, and that is that their peak performance as well. Now, if you build the foundations in a really robust way, you can also look at some of the world's best tennis players inside the top 10 who have been so fortunate not to develop a substantial injury that derails them, or two, they unfortunately have developed one, but they've put in the work and they've recovered quite quickly, which is incredibly important. So by implementing these patterns of play, you not only mitigate, so safeguard your performance, and this is long term. It is actually one of the fundamental keys to developing a top 10 player. And I don't give them away, too easily, because we know that there is a pattern in the work that's involved. So just because you know what one key may be, you really need to understand and consistently and continuously implement it into your training load and your patterns for it to actually work. If you're just given it on a platter, hey, this is a key, then no, oftentimes you are conscious of it, but it's about being able to consciously and consistently implement it time and time again. And that's why we talk about that 10-year pathway, because it doesn't just happen overnight. Okay, so getting back to, functional movement parameters, and when we're looking specifically at your center of gravity, again, if you want to follow along, we're on page 104. A key ingredient in functional movement is the role of an athlete's center of gravity. Essentially, the center of gravity is located when an athlete is standing upright in the middle of their body. An easy way of pinpointing an athlete's center of gravity is by locating the hip area where their center of gravity predominantly sits. However, when an athlete begins to move, their center of gravity moves as well. The center of gravity will only move around this position. Think forwards, backwards, or sideways, whereas the hip area is a consistent and approximate height for the center of gravity, which was discussed throughout my doctorate. For example, the role of the center of gravity in sport and its role in producing a functional movement can be found and identified through various sports. Well, specifically when we're looking at tennis, it is so critical and fundamental to be conscious of this. So, for example, if you are standing upright and they give you a gentle nudge, your center of gravity is compromised and it moves backwards because of that push. However, if you brace yourself for that push, more simply here, you brace yourself, you bend your knees, you bend your hips just a little bit, just slightly, then you are in a better position to not being pushed over. Hopefully you're following here in this, is very simplified, format. And when we look at performance and we look at the kinetic chain and the force, momentum that's involved, all of this is included when we're looking at those optimal performance practices and parameters, which means look at where your center of gravity is and be incredibly mindful, specifically, in tennis, but irrespective of what sport you play, and you will notice a difference. If, however, you are not conscious of this movement, if you are not being, mindful of your center of gravity, and your coach is not monitoring where it is moving and conditioning you to be conscious of that, that's a red flag. If you are that coach out there, 1, please read The Secrets to Optimal Performance Success. But 2, upskill and get your head around what a center of gravity is and where it is and how it works. I think the most phenomenal aspect here is that we know, and it's a part of the work that I've uncovered, is that your center of gravity is fundamental. And if you are not conscious of that, it has a direct correlation, and I'll say that again, a direct, not indirect, a direct correlation with the technical parameters associated with a top 10 ranking. Now, I'm not going to repeat that, you're going to have to rewind it, but it is so critical and so fundamental that I can go up to any athlete, any player, and if they are not mindful of that location and moving, the specific technical parameters with this in mind, you betcha, I can let you know that you are off track. However, there's a specific correlation here and a pattern that's involved. So I can walk up and have a look at whether you're a top 10 player, a top 100 player, and let you know if you are on track to developing a top 10 ranking or nope, that's not going to happen. And that is how critical it is, how fundamental it is, which also means if you are that developmental player and you are able to integrate this into your game, not only are you looking at safeguarding yourself, mitigating injury long term, you are building the foundations of what it takes to become a top 10 player. It is that exciting. Look, it's the same case. If you're that 18, 19, 20-year-old, 21-year-old, and you are ranked 80 in the world, if you are not implementing this, I'm sorry, your ascension towards the top 10 is going to be halted, and at a time it's going to stagnate, which means you are going to plateau, whether that's a top 50, top 40, top 30. You see it time and time again. Not every player every year progresses towards the top 10, and there is a reason why. And that's, I guess, the most powerful part of using science and data, where it's actually able to find a significant, I guess, statistical correlations, the differences, etc., that's associated with when we're looking at this output. And I know that could sound like a bit of, I guess, scientific jargon to mumbo jumbo to some people, to a lot of people. But what we're saying is that it's not merely an opinion. We have a lot of work that backs this up. And if you have been following my work, we're looking at in the hundreds of thousands, specifically with WTA and ATP Tour players. A lot of scientific research in this area is in the tens, as in 10, 20, 50 players. Or a lot less. They could be on groups of 5, 6, 7. It's substantially insignificant in comparison. So when you have data sets that are this significant, and it has grown over time to over 150,000, which is phenomenal, we get the same results. So what this says, it flags down this big red flag that says if you are not mindful of your center of gravity, then one, you are not mindful of the V by Dr. B, which is the technical parameter that you need to be integrating, have the knowledge of and awareness of, and implementing into your game. Which means, and the center of gravity is directly correlated with the V by Dr. B. That's in other works, specifically the Science of Elite Performance. And when we're looking at this and integrating this technical parameter, not only do you get to develop a top 10 ranking, you are privy to replicated success, which means more than one Grand Slam. However, again, and I know this is a lot when we're talking about something so simple as your center of gravity and balance, believe it or not, because your center of gravity is responsible for your balance, which means you should always be mindful of this, whether you are on the tennis court, irrespective of where you are when you're playing with your friends. It does not matter. You use your center of gravity in everyday life simply not to fall over. And so when you are obviously training and you have that training load to your schedule and you're working out what new key factors to facets that you're implementing within your patterns of play, your center of gravity is critical. Now, we're going to touch on a couple of examples of how these transition through other sports. So again, if you're following on, let's keep going. Baseball. An athlete's center of gravity in baseball plays a key role in producing a functional movement. In order for an athlete to make contact with the oncoming ball and to swing through the ball's trajectory, it's by shifting their center of gravity slightly forwards. By moving the center of gravity forward, this allows the player to combat the additional force they need to withstand in order to push through the ball at contact and to follow the planned trajectory. Now, what type of similarities are there? And ask yourself, because when we look at baseball, there is, I think, wonderful correlations there with tennis. Because not only is it a ball sport in that respect, where you are hitting, your movement from through your hips to your follow through, it has, I think, many similarities in this respect, and specifically when we're looking at those technical parameters to those foundations. The next sport we've got is soccer. A soccer player's center of gravity is constantly moving and changing as a direct consequence of the location of the ball and the player's ability to keep and maintain their field position. The role, however, of the center of gravity is essential to player performance. In order to establish and maintain an upright position whilst in motion, the player is reliant on their center of gravity. They are continuously shifting their center of gravity sideways, backwards, or forwards. And now this goes on, but again, ask yourself, soccer has a lot of similarities with a tennis player's movement, specifically when we're looking at, dynamic footwork and dynamic balance. So there is a difference between that balance and dynamic balance and being able to control that. And it's how you control that is being conscious of and mindful of your center of gravity and being able to control, you betcha, its location. All right, specifically when we're looking at tennis, the role of the center of gravity in tennis is a combination of baseball and soccer due to the continuous requirements to contact the ball whilst continuously changing position as a result of where the ball lands and where the player follows through in order to correctly execute and transition through their shot. Believe it or not. The height of the center of gravity in tennis players is continuously changing due to the variety of shot options, which places the center of gravity in a compromising position continuously. The height of the center of gravity in tennis is continuously changing due to the variety of shot options, which places an increased demand on the body and the need for functional movement, and is even more essential to ensure the player is able to not only maintain their position, but to ensure over time their body is not in a compromised state and thus promoting the onset of injuries. Now, how substantial to mind-blowing is that? And I really hope that you're following along going, oh my goodness, because when you're able to control your center of gravity, it really does mitigate, it limits that onset of injuries, because not only when you are in a state of balance are you protecting those key joints, you're also promoting functional movement parameters. Now, when we are integrating to applying functional movement throughout play, we are naturally safeguarding our body and with that mitigating injuries. And it is so important, so simple, but also often overlooked. And it's something that we do without being conscious of it each and every waking hour when we are standing. And I mean, we can be doing or should be doing it also when we're sitting to obviously promote good posture, which again is a functional movement parameter. It is there irrespective of where you are. You can't get rid of it. It's so critical and fundamental. And when we're really looking at tennis, there is a direct correlation with your center of gravity and where you hit the ball, which is a huge significant key when we're looking at that pathway to developing a top 10 player, to developing that top 10 ranking. Now, if you're not privy to the knowledge behind that correlation, we know that top 10 ranking is not within reach, which means you are not going to become a barrier breaker. So if you remember or have recalled from the introductions, when I've mentioned barrier breaker, this is it, which means are you going to cross the threshold? Now, this was coined in, I think, what is your game missing and the resultant text. So that's a series of 3 to what is your game missing now and what is your game missing to win, which really breaks down the elite players on the WTA Tour and ATP Tours and showcases whether or not they're poised to become a barrier breaker. So if they are positioned at this point in time to develop a top 10 ranking. And I think most interestingly, our current world number 1 on the WTA Tour, they were poised to become a barrier breaker before they won their maiden championship, which is incredibly exciting. And I know I've touched on this before, but so have other players. For example, Osaka, she was poised to win more than one Grand Slam when we were able to look at her performance and the optimal performance practices that continuously have been, I think, illustrated through her level of play. Now, obviously, there's more to that when we're, looking at the data and the science behind that and the specific principles to the technical parameters involved. But these are just two examples when we're looking at the best players in the world and saying, you know what? Balance is fundamental. Your center of gravity is absolutely pivotal. And these players, of course, we're able to identify and see their center of gravity in motion, in play, and being controlled, and how it is obviously integrated to mitigate injuries. We have players that are performing incredibly high. Recall one player on the WTA Tour who did win a championship and then they've been riddled with injuries. Now, there's obviously a lot more to that story, but we know that if those foundations are not built, you are going to be susceptible to this, which means if you are that player and you're performing at an incredibly high level and you have not built these foundations and consciously being mindful of this, you are susceptible. And it's heartbreaking and it's incredibly sad, but you are susceptible. And the same goes, again, if you've been following and listening to previous episodes about the coaching pedagogy and that coach-athlete relationship. And if it is continuously changing, if it is continuously broken, you are not privy to the golden rule. Which again, I know that this is where I mention it in the intro. And today you would have noticed it's very short and very concise because, we're getting to know each other, I hope, and you're becoming more and more familiar with this work, which is incredibly exciting, which means not only do we know if you're going to become a barrier breaker, we know if you are privy to or you align with what I have coined as the golden rule. And only a couple of players actually, or active players now, are privy to this. So if you are following along and you want to become a top 10 player and you're privy to now my work, you are capable of being aligned with replicated success and the golden rule. And oh my goodness, yes, it starts with many other things, but also your center of gravity, your level of consciousness around balance and how you're integrating that through your training load, through your play, how it is being conditioned within, I think, off court in your conditioning. And it's something so simple but so vital and fundamental that I think we're going to really finish on this by honing in on what is, I think, your training load and how are you integrating this? And this comes back to, I think, again, previous episode where we've touched on your intention and when you step onto the court or the field, irrespective where you are, but specifically, if we're looking at tennis, what is your intent when you are on court? Are you mindful of your center of gravity? And I can guarantee you 99.9% of you out there are not. Because one, you're probably focusing on getting the ball back or getting the ball in. One or the other. If you've already reached getting the ball back, you're focusing on getting it in. And then, most likely, you're focusing on hitting it harder and harder and harder. But if we are building the foundations, we need to strip that back and make sure you're using your center of gravity to your advantage, that it is integrated within your technical parameters, so your patterns of play of how you're going about contacting the oncoming ball. And it's so simple when we strip it all back and say, where is your center of gravity? If we're looking at, again, functional movement and building those foundations that integrate functional movement parameters, let's start with your center of gravity. Where is it? When you're on court, are you conscious of it? Are you conscious of your center of gravity when that ball is coming? All right. Now, I know this sounds like a lot to think about, but we pull it all back and focus one by one. So one session, you're going to be conscious of where your center of gravity is. It's that simple. And then you're going to work towards the two, looking at the correlation between your center of gravity and where that oncoming ball is and the alignment. Now, if we use this through the building blocks of play, I like that one. You progressively are conditioning yourself to build this new skill. And we're doing this and we're not even looking at your technique. We're not even looking at the rest of your technical parameters. We're just looking at this very refined and simple relationship between your center of gravity and the ball, your center of gravity and balance, your center of gravity and how it is a part of functional movement parameters, and your center of gravity, and that acknowledging it is a functional movement or integrated within and responsible for, more often than not, developing a functional movement, and affords us to include functional movement patterns of play within our performance. So again, if we're looking at developing that optimal performance outcome, let's, I think, flip the switch about what your balance means to you, what center of gravity means to you, and how, when there's so much information out there, so much literature out there, how we can really pull it back and simplify it. And the best part is about being the world's leading scientist on coach and athlete performance, uncovering specifically and scientifically with all the data on W10 ATP Tour players how to develop a top 10 ranking. I've done the hard work for you, which means I've been able to pull it all back and find that blueprint that you need to develop a top 10 ranking. And believe it or not, this is how it's so simple, because I love simple. That's what science affords us to really refine it. And I think that's the power of knowledge as well, and being able to share. So I really hope today you've been able to take away the power of balance, but also, I guess, most fundamentally, the center of gravity and how they work hand in hand, and how your center of gravity is tied to functional movement. And obviously there's a multitude of offshoots there. So if that is your biggest takeaway from today, that's incredible. Irrespective of, the barrier breaker to the golden rule to replicated success and so forth, it all starts, it starts with, you've listened to previous episodes, hopefully by now, from those, your pedagogic framework to that coach-athlete relationship to, again, the other. We can look at it from that side. And look, there has been a previous episode most recently on balance, but we're talking, this is a next level up. So it's not just the role of balance. We're going up a level here, and we're going, okay, what's next? We're progressing here. We're progressing together. That's what we're doing. So center of gravity, and just flipping that switch to, okay, we're progressing, we're going up a level now, so let's get started. Let's start integrating this into our training load, into our training practices, and if we are on the road to ascending towards, irrespective of what your current ranking is, we're working at developing that top 10 tennis ranking, which also means if you're currently ranked 15 in the world and you are integrating everything as we say, but you're not privy to the 7 keys, and or you're not conscious of your center of gravity, let's get serious by implementing this, integrating this further, and solidifying this, conditioning it into our patterns of play. And you know what? Within the next 6 to 12 months, you're going to be knocking on the door to become a barrier breaker and watch out top 10. And that's how I think exciting science is, and the work is, and how serious I think we are at Beyond Top 10 Tennis, because we stand by it. Okay, this is a lot. As you can see, I get very excited by it because it's so important, but also as that athlete who has experienced or did experience so many injuries throughout my playing career that just sidelined me, derailed me each and every time I peaked. This is for you. This is for each and every one of you out there, whether you are that parent, the player, or the coach. Begin to integrate and become more conscious of your center of gravity and the role it plays, and we can work towards developing that top 10 tennis ranking. Thank you so much for joining us today. To grab a copy of The Secrets to Optimal Performance Success, please head on over to AM8 International. That's am8international.com. For any comments or questions, again, head on over to AM8 International or Topic Thread. That's the only social network that I'm on. But also, most recently, whether it's Instagram, Twitter, or believe it or not, TikTok, have a look for Beyond Top 10 Tennis there and share your feedback. The same goes with each and every episode. We have those questions, those Q&As. Please, have a peek, and if you do have the time, answer it, because as I've previously shared, I read each and every one of them, and it allows me to look at what I can share even more in the following episodes and how I can best frame and shape those additional insights when we're working towards that top 10 ranking. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, follow, like, share. That would be absolutely phenomenal. The more of you out that obviously do that, we're working together to not only mitigate injuries, but build the next generation of play, which is so phenomenal, exciting, and rewarding. On that note, I am so grateful. Thank you so much for listening. I'm your host, Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge, and this is Beyond Top 10 Tennis, and I'll see you next time.